Hello everyone, welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. The museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who have served in it. There are many ways you can support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Andy Robertshaw. Andy is a military historian, author and broadcaster who specialises in military history from the early 17th century to the modern day. He's written several books on military history and archaeology. Today, Andy will provide a fascinating insight into the work of the Centre for Experimental Archaeology, exploring the day-to-day life of historic soldiers in the Great War through practical experimentation. So there will be time for questions at the end of this discussion for both our online and in-person audience. For our online audience, just put them in the chat bar and we'll put them to the speaker at the end of the talk. Moving on with some technical points. Should we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us while we work to rectify them. If your stream freezes, we usually suggest you click the refresh button. That usually cures all ills. A member of our team will be active in the chat bar to assist you should you have any issues or queries. With that all said, I will now pass you over to Andy, and I hope you enjoy this talk.
Thank you, Carla. Okay. Thank you. It's nice to be back. Just to start off with a couple of bits and pieces for you. I've arrived here a little bit later than perhaps everyone would have liked because I've spent the morning costuming about 18 people for a very small film on the work of the British West Indies Regiment in the First World War. Because having left the Army Museum, I then moved into the world of movies and then went from that to running a costume and prop house, which is something that I do. However, the real nuts and bolts of my life has been said, the reality of the experience of men and women who served in the Great War. And I have to tell you now that when I first came here in 1984, one of the veterans in the Royal Hospital next door had served in the Boer War. And there were lots of people who'd served in the Great War. And it was very, very easy to wander over there with your little microphone and a couple of beers later, and you had stories about the Great War. And one of those stories was as follows. I interviewed a couple of guys who came from Norfolk, Suffolk area. I grew up on the Essex-Suffolk border. And one of the guys that I spoke to said to me, "Turn that off, boy." And I turned off my cassette recorder. Remember those things? Yeah, okay. Played, record, turned it off. I'd got my cup of tea in front of me. I'm from Yorkshire, as you can probably tell. I hate tea, but I wasn't going to tell him that. And he said to me, "I'll tell you something about the war you can't imagine." Well, I've read lots of books, so I thought about your mate shot through the head while you talk to him. I thought about possibly your mate coughing up his lungs with gas, a horse blown up a tree, probably called Joey or Topthorn. You'll know the reference. And he said to me, I remember it in colour. So when it came to working for Peter Jackson, I'm going to drop names here, I'm afraid, and we were discussing what he might do with the film, I suggested that film really should be colorized. When the film came out, a number of online critics, and some that actually were in mainstream media, said, "Oh, well, the only reason that they've colorized it is to make it more interesting to children." Now, the reason that we colorized it is that's because how people experienced the war. And one of the veterans that said to me, another one, he said, "My war was 90% bored stiff, 9% frozen stiff, and 1% scared stiff." And of course, what we see on the big screen, and I'm sorry about this, whether it's Wonder Woman, which wasn't historically very accurate, I wonder why that was, or War Horse, or 1917, is the battle sequence. If you think about it, every time a movie starts about the Great War, it will begin with a panning shot. Nowadays, it could be done with a drone. It's always raining, because everybody knows it rained all the time in the Great War. The colour palette is very sepia, because we already know the Great War was in black and white, not in colour. There are shell holes. There's a wagon wheel and a dead horse. How that wagon wheel and dead horse got in no man's land, I don't know, but they're going to be there. And eventually the camera drops into a trench where someone's playing a bloody harmonica. And then an officer turns up in a wonderful uniform. Everybody else is filthy. They have to be filthy because that shows that they're oppressed. And then what happens is that he blows a whistle, everyone goes over the top and they get machine gunned. And that's the end of it. Now, my grandfather was John Andrew Robertshaw. He was Private 41957, later Private 31085. He was a soldier for 1,000 days. Now, allowing for the fact that he was wounded twice and gassed twice, out of his 1,000 days as a soldier, how many days was he in the trenches? Well, I'll tell you. I calculated the other day, it was exactly 100 days. 1 day in 10 of his military experience, allowing for a few times in hospital and training and everything else that he actually did. So one of the things that was of interest to me was really the reality of the Great War. And I was working in that time for a TV series called 2 Minute Trench. Tony Pollard from the University in Glasgow and Neil Oliver, before he went a little bit to the right. And what happened was that I happened to be working at the time on this project here. And this is the back garden of Avril Williams at Ocean Villas on the Somme. And we excavated over the series of seasons, basically a week every Easter for 5 years, a communication trench system. And one of the things that we found in that communication trench system was a brick lining to it. And members of the public, who were no doubt more expert than I, would turn up, stand on the edge, look into it and say, yeah, well, that was put by the family after the war when they lived in the cellar, which would have been really good had it not been that I'd actually read the war diaries, and it was actually led by the 2nd Monmouthshire Regiments in July 1915. But the strange thing then was, we then discovered that on top of the brick layer was a layer of clay, and then a layer of broken tiles. And again, experts said, well, that's because when the shells hit the roof, the tiles fell into the trench, which is logical, except some of this tiling was about 50 meters away from the building line. So it was quite a big explosion, wasn't it? And then I discovered in the war diary, it was mentioning that in the winter of 15 to 16, stretcher bearers were arriving at the Red Barn, the dressing station, with their boots around their neck because they couldn't get a grip on the clay on top of the bricks. So what we discovered, wait for it, was health and safety 1915 style, crushed brick. And that led to this next project, because we were then I was working for the BBC. Someone in the BBC said, could you put a team together to do an excavation on where Wilfred Owen was in 1917? And this is Serres. Some of you might know, we've got my back at the camera now to Serres Cemetery number 2. We're looking down towards the French cemetery on the other side of the road, and that chapel there is actually in memory of the Battle of Ébueterne in June 1915. And within minutes of starting work, we had trenches. You can see snaking off into the background a white chalk mark. And again, members of the public helpfully came along and said, oh, that's because after the war, the local farmer living at Lassigny Farm had come back and filled the trench in with chalk. Well, think about it. 1919, 1920, you're going to get wheelbarrows full of chalk and fill the trench in. I don't think so. Again, what happened was I looked at the war diary, in this case, of the 121st Reserve Regiment. When we attacked on the 1st of July 1916, they blew 4 mines under the road, backfilling their own trenches with chalk. And although when the documentary series came out, Ancestors about Wilfred Owen, David Owen was able to, the nephew was able to stand and say, this is where my great uncle walked. Well, only if he could wade through chalk. But the key thing was that straight away we found human remains. And what we found was the collarbone, or both collarbones, of what turned out to be a Württemberg soldier who, when fully exposed, looks more like that. Obviously, we haven't got his legs yet. We've got his belt buckle, we've got his ammunition pouches, we've got his buttons. Why is his head gone? Well, he's been laid in a natural position. He's lying in a shell hole. And altogether, we found 27 sets of human remains. Well, about 27. Well, how can it be about? Well, we found 3 soldiers basically up on the Regina Trench. We found them from the pelvis downwards. We found a hand and we found a pair of feet. Oh, we also found another foot inside a sandbag on Vimy Ridge. So about 27 sets of remains. And what it really made me think was, what was the reality of the experience that these men had had? They'd all died in combat, but when you then start thinking that although we kind of remember the war through the cemeteries, and clearly here ahead of development work, we're finding mass graves, this particular one had 5 bodies in it, it represents for the British 11.8% of soldiers. Do you want that again? 11.8% of British soldiers die. That means that 88% of soldiers, like my granddad, fail to die. And actually, their story is almost forgotten because it's not the combat that we always see on the screen, because that's what we imagine. And here, working at night, recovering this lot, was one of the most unpleasant things I have ever done. However, it led me to then lecture in wound trauma for the Norwegian Army. But it also gave me very great respect for the real experience. And back in 2011, you might recognize the ears and you might recognize the glasses. I'm the officer that blows the whistle in the film Warhorse. In fact, that morning, Steven Spielberg, or Stevie Baby as I called him, no, I called him Mr. Spielberg, said to me, "Andy, you're going to enjoy today because you're going to be the officer blowing the whistle." And I said, "I'm not going to enjoy it, sir." "Why not?" "Because my granddad did it 4 times, and every time he did it, he got wounded. I know too much about it to enjoy it." And at the end of it, I took the decision to build a replica trench about which I could get photography to do 24-hour trench. That's what I wanted to do. And that 24-hour trench was born here. What happened is repeatedly we looked at the old museum and the old replica trench system, which was a little bit boring. I suggested, having seen a similar idea in America, that what we do is we go through 24 hours in a trench, from basically morning stand to stand down, get your rum ration, cook your breakfast, clean up, inspection, dinner, afternoon sleeping, because that's when you sleep, stand to in the evening after your dinner, nighttime read, all of that. And every time we got into this, and it was all going to be done with graphics, oh, could we do a trench raid? No, why not? Because they're incredibly rare. Could we do a big battle? Even rarer. How about a gas attack? Now, couldn't we just show 24 hours in a normal trench without that? Because that's the most common experience. I remember many years ago going to the Tate Gallery to talk about the way we understand the role of soldiers, taking with me a grenade, an inert one, and a mess tin, and asking art teachers what was typical of a soldier's experience. And they all went, "The grenade." I went, "Most soldiers throw 1 grenade in training and never throw one again. Every soldier gets 3 square meals a day. It's the mess tin." And this led to certain confusion. So you can see that my interest really is that combination of interviews, the chance to get too close to the real thing, and then the reality of soldiers who have a drink. Obviously, I mean a soft drink, you know, who eat food, who work, we go to sleep, we go to the toilet. They're the 5 things that we all do, that soldiers do. And that was what I was interested in. And immediately it began really leading to looking at this. You see, this is digging in. Now, notice I didn't say entrenching. Trenching was taught before the war, but the thing that you're carrying on your waist and on your bum was called initially a pick mattock. It only becomes an entrenching tool when we dig trenches. Until then, it's a pick mattock. Nowadays, we'd say, oh, it's an entrenching tool. And here it was taught. Basically, you dig a hole to get your left arm in, you get low, you throw the earth in front of you. If needs be, you get your haversack, throw that in front of that one, get some cover behind it. Because actually, initially, nobody knew it would end up being trench warfare. But it does end up being trench warfare. And this is how our trenches are meant to look. Now, having done the archaeology, I can tell you that the perfect trench shown in our manual here of 1912 looks nothing like the real thing. This is the real thing. It's a higgledy-piggledy mess. It's wet and it's muddy. But bear in mind one small problem. When they built the set for Warhorse, they showed shell holes, barbed wire, lots of water, constant drizzle. However, the battle we were portraying was meant to be the 8th of August 1918, which is fought near Amiens on a chalk plain in a heat wave. So when I asked why had they done the shell holes and the dead horse and that, they went, unless we show it with rain and shell holes, people won't know which war we're talking about. How about that? We've backed ourselves into a corner of the real experience. And this then is the real experience. Here we've got men, actually Australians, in a trench, this one without its normally provided trench boards. And what we've done over at the Kent Event Centre is to copy a piece of trench from, well, here it is. I'm not going to walk towards it. It's up towards the top. It's called railway wood. The red items you can see are craters. There are some blue ones as well. And you might remember from the film Oh, What a Lovely War, they're copying it down in railway wood tonight. And although my first trench, which was actually near Charlwood in Surrey, by the way, it was never in my back garden, okay? Despite the Daily Mail, no gnomes were injured in the making of that trench. Actually, it was a piece of ground adjacent to where we lived, but I love the expression, boffin builds trench. Well, fine, I'll happily be a boffin if that's what they want. But what interested me about it then was this possibility of having a much bigger project. And the bigger project now is at the Kent Event Centre, where I was this morning, where we now have a chunk of German front line, we have a chunk of British front line, we even have a light railway. Well, let's face it, it couldn't be railway wood without a railway, could it? Okay, and we're in a wood and we're on a hill like the real thing. But the key thing about it is this, that we're driven then by a manual. This is a 4th Division manual telling you what you'll do. And if you look at the trench routine, it says by day, 1 in 10 man's on guard duty. At night, proportion is 1 in 3. 1 man on guard duty, 1 man resting, 1 man working all night. And last night, by the way, probably get no more than about 6 hours work done. In the middle of winter, you get a lot more work done. So actually, although it may be wet and cold, in terms of improving your trenches or putting up the barbed wire, winter's better than summer for those kind of things. It tells you here, breakfast, 9 a.m. After breakfast, clean up trenches, doing the necessary work. 12 noon dinner, afternoon sleep, 4 o'clock tea, all of that. It's all there. And yet, what I wanted to do for the book, and ultimately for everybody, was to say, this is what's happening hour by hour, minute by minute. And this is what my granddad did. So we built a replica trench. We used the correct materials. We used wicker. We used trench boards. Obviously, our sandbags, and it always gets the kids, every time. Got sandbags here. What's in the bags? Sand, sir. Only on a beach, son. Full of clay or chalk, or in the case of the sandbag on Vimy Ridge, a boot with a foot in it. We then actually left the trench alone for about 4 months. So it kind of became a little bit weathered. It certainly got very wet. And in our dugout, we got about 1 foot of water and about 1 foot of water in our collapses. Now, the first bit of experimentation here is this. I am involved back in the early part of the century doing quite a lot of Great War archaeology. And when people showed me bits of angle iron bent over at right angles, what caused this? And I'd stand in front of them and go, oh, well, that would be shell fire. Yeah, definitely shell fire. Well, I'll tell you what, all of that damage there, including the collapses, we oddly, at Charlwood, next to Gatwick Airport, didn't get much shell fire. we got quite a lot of rain, and that means the clay gets very waterlogged, and against a sheet of corrugated iron, although you've driven in 3 or 4 steel pickets and think that'll hold it, it doesn't. It bends them at an angle. So as soon as you start doing that and you start looking at collapses like this, which has completely blocked the trench, you start to realize a couple of things. And one thing I did was to invite serving soldiers to help me, and also some serving officers. And one serving officer, now a colonel, having begun his career in the extremely unglamorous Pioneer Corps, said, "There's one good thing about trenches." I went, "Well, what's that?" He said, "You never get bored soldiers. There's always something to do." The problem, by the way, for the British particularly, is we tend to send our men to hold a section of line for a while, then we move them somewhere else so they don't get too familiar with it. The German army would simply rotate you through one brigade in the line, then another brigade takes over from the same division, then another one, which means that any improvements you work, you get the benefit for. Does that make sense? And that also explains something else. Remember, German trenches are better than ours, not because a Württemberger or a Saxon is better at digging. It's because they can win the war by staying where they are. The Allies, be they the French or the Belgians or the Brits, the only way we can win the war is by attacking. And by the way, the Germans choose where they dig in. They fall back to the most advantageous ground. And it might surprise you to learn the most effective weapon system in the Great War is a telephone, linked to an artillery battery, and as long as you've got your eyes on the enemy and they're below you, you can do a great deal of damage. And then you go, oh, of course, Vimy Ridge, Passchendaele, oh, they're all hills. So when we start attacking and get halfway up the hill, why don't we stop? Well, the answer is, until we've got to the top of the hill, the ridge at Vimy, or the ridge at the village of Passchendaele, we have not effectively blinded our opponents, because then we can see over where they are. They are then at the disadvantage. So bear that in mind about why German trenches are better than ours. And one of the things that then this came to it was the nuts and bolts of being a soldier. And this then is the complete kit layout of a soldier going into the autumn phase of what we now know as Passchendaele, originally the Third Battle of Ypres. And this particular image appears in my book, 24-Hour Trench. And the number of people who get, oh, isn't he typical of the British soldier of the Great War? He's typical of soldiers who were 22. The average age of British soldiers in the Great War was 26. The average age of British soldiers in the Australian and Canadian Army is 27. The average age of soldiers on D-Day or in Italy is 24, and recently the average age of soldiers in Afghanistan is 22. We have obviously a few underage soldiers, and that young man there was about to go to Afghanistan when that photograph was taken, and basically I dressed him up. But for our experiment, we used a combination of reenactors, or living historians, and archaeologists. Why do we use archaeologists? Because they're the people who are going to be going in to actually excavate the remains. They need to know where things were. So if you're going to put an archaeologist into a uniform, he will then know, where would you put your watch? Where would you put your packet of fags? Where would you put your candles to keep them nice and dry? You know, that's what we're going to do. And to make it really challenging, we did this in January. We followed the war diary of a division, the 55th Division, and we made them go in daylight. In reality, you go into trenches at night. You have a relief, and as the people leave, you take over. The people that have already been there for 5 days or 48 hours in the middle of winter are very keen to get away. You're very keen to know what the hell's going on. And if you want to understand that, look at the play or look at the film Journey's End, because the handover is very peremptory. They want to get out. You want to know what's going on. So what I did, I let them take over in daylight. I gave them an officer. And virtually the first thing that we did was our stand to. Stand to at night basically means that 1 hour before, well, half an hour before daylight, darkness, what you do, every man is in the trench, rifle and bayonet fixed. Now, we had to clear this with Gatwick Airport, I'm not kidding, that actually we wanted to then fire some flares. We didn't want anyone to think that an Airbus had just come down somewhere near Charlwood. And actually, the people at the Gatwick Airport said, yeah, we know all about it, it's not a problem. But then what happened was nighttime routine. 1 man on guard duty, 1 man resting, 1 man working. Which means if you've got a section of 9 men, how many men were working at any one time? Answer 3. The others are either resting or on guard duty. Straight away, whether you're an NCO or an officer, you start to realize actually you don't have much of a workforce with those numbers because you can't all be doing it. And what really matters to the men, and by the way, it was below 0 for the entire experiment, is the fact that actually being near the brazier is where you wanted to be. Get your feet out of the mud, because that's important to avoid trench foot. By the way, to make it realistic, we actually did provide dry socks for the men. Big problem was that actually next morning, just like the real thing, it took real coercion to get men with wet feet to take their puttees off, to take their boots off, and take their wet socks off. They don't want to do it, even though actually it's already quite dangerous. And we had early onset of what might have been trench foot within about 12 hours of beginning our experiment. So the idea was that our experiment recreates that. Now, we didn't actually want people to get bitten by rats or actually get trench foot, but we wanted them to get an understanding of it and then at the end of it have a bit of a debrief. You can imagine at the end of that period of darkness, which is roughly, in this case, about 11 hours, we had our morning stand to, half an hour before it gets fully light, every man standing head and shoulders above the parapet, then dropping down as it gets dark, and as soon as it becomes light, the officer there is judging, is it now time to put the periscope up? Yes, it is. Then, as you already know from earlier on, 1 man intends on guard duty. Now, just think about it. If we were to make a film realistically about trenches on an ordinary day in an ordinary sector, and we were to do our panning shot down the trench, what would we have? I'll tell you what we'd have. About now, just finishing off dinner, about to go on to afternoon routine, which would mean that basically you and you and you are on guard duty for 2 hours. Everybody else is clearly going to be writing war poems. No, they're not. They've got their head down, or they're writing a letter home, or they're playing a game of cards. And guess what? It would make absolutely appalling television or movie time. Why? Because it's boring. But remember what my veteran said. 90% bored stiff, 9% frozen stiff, 1% scared stiff. And what really mattered to them was food. Here, hygienically inspecting rations on the way up to the line in the real thing. This is the real thing. And notice, by the way, even for my original images, I'm using colorized ones just to make my point about the Great War in color. And can I remind you that the Great War in color is actually more than just sepia on the screen. It's also this: lions, donkeys, butchers, bunglers. The reality is in the middle of those two extremes. My grandfather was asked in 1963, shortly before he died, by my dad, why did he volunteer in 1914? And the answer was to get the uniform off. Did he want to be a soldier? No. But it was the right thing to do. The moral compass of the day said, we're going to help Belgium and we're going to help our French allies, and we will then drive the Germans out. And my granddad came home and got on with the rest of his life. But talking to the veterans next door and then elsewhere, what they remembered was the arrival of the tea bucket, the arrival of hot stew brought up from behind. And one thing that we did for our reenactment here was actually during the night, we told them hot stew was being sent up. Everybody got very enthusiastic. It was about midnight. And at midnight, I very cruelly sent this young man up the line. It wasn't very far, probably 20 meters, but with a full container of what apparently was food. Actually, what it was hot water. And at the appropriate moment, he fell over and dropped it. You could hear an audible groan go up. Why? Because what matters to soldiers when they're wet and cold is the rum ration. What matters to them actually is getting food in their belly. And look at this, because this is a group of the real soldier here at a YMCA canteen, having a wet, having a brew. It is worth saying, by the way, that during the Great War, these guys would have referred to it as char or chai. Remember, no British soldier ever does any laundry. He does dobying. Okay? No British soldier actually looks at a girl. He looks at a bint. He never has a look. He has a deco. It's really strange. As we've become more multicultural as a nation, our armed forces have become less redolent of use of foreign language. One of the things that we did was we gave the guys the amount of food every man would get every day. And it's a staggering amount of food. And one of the things that we did was to say to them before we started, read some memoirs. And one of them did just that. And when the bacon arrived, he remembered that if he'd put his bacon in his mess tin and put it over an open fire, all you do is melt the tin. If you take your entrenching tool head, sorry, Pigmatic, you know where I'm going now, don't you? And you clean it up and you put that over a fire, that's what you're going to get, nice crispy bacon. And talking to veterans about things that, interest me, what they always said was they all remembered one smell from the trenches. And I, at the time, probably said, what, corpses? No. Gas? No. What? Bacon first thing in the morning. That was what they remembered. And here, one of my soldiers having something to eat. And one of the things that we then did was we insisted that everybody have a shave. Now this happens to be Neil, and he's using his shaving brush in the appropriate fashion. By the way, using the remains of his tea as was described. But apparently the effect was slightly sticky because it had plenty of sugar in it, but it worked rather well. Why do we make them do that? Well, because they did for reality. The small box respirator has to be tight to your face. If you have designer stubble, you just die of gas poisoning. And since then, I've met a guy called David Whitehorn who was taught to shave by his grandfather. And the technique was really, really interesting. I've actually got it on a website. And one of the things that I then had to do for a film was to teach 2 actors how to shave Great War style. Now, I couldn't afford to let them cut themselves because they're lovies and they wouldn't like that. So what I did was, having spoken to my barber, how should I do it? He said, get them to put shaving soap onto a balloon, hold the balloon, and then hold the cutthroat razor at the correct angle. If they get it wrong, they get covered in shaving foam. Guess what? They learned quite quickly how to do it, then they could shave themselves, and then the entire scene was cut from the movie. But anyway, we did our best. Now, one of the things that you'll find if you look in the archives of the National Army Museum, or where I used to work, the Royal Logistic Corps Museum, is many, many letters from soldiers home. Sometimes a brief postcard, some one of those things called a whiz-bang, I am well, I have been, whatever, you know the ones I mean, the cross-out ones. There are very few letters from home that survive. Why is this? Oh, yes. There is no issue toilet paper. So when you go into your trench, you take with you a tin box with lots and lots of folded up bits of newspaper or whatever you can find. A lot of families at home were amazed about how religious their young ones had become. Please send me a Bible, Mummy. Okay. It's nice, smooth paper in the right size. You've got the idea. And of course, here is our soldier having a final read of the letter from home before it's consigned to a watery grave. Now, that's the reality of it. And I have to say that my veteran said to me, boy, he said, this is the same Suffolk soldier. He's very memorable. He said, on day one morning when in the trenches, you had a clean hand and a clean hand. By day 2 or day 3, you had a clean hand and a toilet hand. He didn't use that term, but you got the idea. Because he's using little sheets of paper. He actually told me that the way that they did it, and I think he may have been having fun at my expense, was they folded them into quarters, tore a little piece out, put a finger through it, used it, and then cleaned the nail out. But what matters here in my story is, did you get fruit in the trenches? Yes. We got oranges and we got apples. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, right, okay. Which did you like? He said, I loved oranges, but not in the trenches. Why not? You need 2 hands to open an orange. The horror of trench warfare may not be being shot through the head or coughing your lungs up with gas. It could simply be the fact you've got a hand you really don't want to look at. The fact that you've got lice. The fact that actually you're stood next to your mate Bert in the dark. You know that Bert's there, even though you can't see him, because you can smell him. By the way, remember, bodily hygiene was not what it is today. It's worth saying that the Duke of Cambridge went to Horse Guards with Queen Victoria in the 1880s, and it was a hot summer's day. As the Queen approached with her son, the doors were opened and there was a waft of body odour. And the Queen said to her son, "What is that smell?" And he said, "Mum, that's esprit de corps." So you've got to bear in mind your esprit de corps. And of course, the key thing about this is that early in the war, the Royal Army Medical Corps were responsible for field laundries and field hygiene. Rapidly, it became a responsibility of the Army Service Corps. So think about it, just out of interest. Again, that reality. It could be that you're a sniper. It could be that you're a rifle bomber. It could be that, I don't know what you did, I don't care. What matters is that somewhere in my room here could be a young lieutenant that was in charge of a field bath unit for 4 years. Now, obviously, my sniper, my bomber has seen some ugly sights. My guy running a field bath unit has seen big hairy jocks come in, strip off, and go through a tub of water, come out the other side, towel off, and get clean clothes on. He's seen some ugly sights, but not the one that the bomber saw. So in 1919, when he's demobilised and he comes home and his son, who's called Tim, by the way, this kid's always called Tim, "Dad, what was it like in the trenches?" "I don't want to talk about it." Just think about how many men never went in the trenches. Think about the 1 in 100 that were as a cook. Not one of them ever came back in 1919 and said, "Darling, you're not going to guess what." Because this guy's married now. "I can cook. Why don't you put your feet up? I'll make tea." What was it like in the trenches? I don't want to talk about it. 50% of our army never go in the trenches. They're gunners. They're our engineers. They're Army Service Corps. My granddad was only in action for 2 years, wounded twice, gassed twice. My wife's granddad was a Rolls-Royce engineer. He spent 5 years effectively driving lorries. Was he wounded? No. Was he gassed? No. The reality is not the one we always think of. And of course, we learn the hard way. Hygiene, using whale oil to stop people getting trench foot. And just to make everything more exciting, we also added in an officer with a telephone. And at one point, a message came from brigade, actually it was me, asking what the unique number was on the latrine bucket. There is no number on a latrine bucket, but he did send a sergeant with a torch to find it. I got cursed for that. There we are. Well, the key thing is I wanted to make it realistic, and that includes completely mundane tasks. That included the arrival of the mail. Thank you, the Postal and Courier Service. By 1916, the biggest structure on Earth was, in fact, where they sorted the mail for the Army Postal and Courier Service. Think about that, the biggest structure on Earth. And a letter or parcel from home could get to the Western Front in 2 to 3 days. Try doing that now. And what do people remember about it? They remember basically a bit of shut-eye, actually being exhausted. And at the end of 24 hours, some of our guys said, I don't want to drive home yet, I need to get some sleep. Because even though we'd let them have their evening or afternoon sleep, they'd only had about 5 hours. So you can imagine 5 days in the trenches is then quite enough. I mentioned the light railway. We've built one of these and we use it to explain to young people. We've had now something like 12,000 young people from Kent and the home counties through about how logistics work. Because, as you already know, I worked for a while at the Royal Logistics Museum. So I'm interested in the idea of how we get the wounded out and how we get food and supplies in. And for people that don't know, one of the things that came out of the trenches was salvage, which would be anything from fired cartridges through to empty tins, and even, would you believe, the skins of frozen rabbits from Australia. They came back to Richborough where they were sorted by refugees. Where were they from? The answer, of course, is Belgium. And those skinned rabbits were actually used to make flying helmets and gloves for the Royal Flying Corps. And then you realize where this leads to. This leads to the next step, and the next step is the recreation of trenches. Notice here the use of chicken wire, and this actually is from the film 1917. Very early on, they had a big problem with cameramen falling over. How could they deal with it? I said, put chicken wire down. Is that authentic? Not only is it authentic, it's in the manual. And I first read it many years ago now. It said chicken wire makes the trench boards fireproof. Made no sense at all until I put some men in the trench for an experiment. And the first thing they did when they wanted to get a fire started was they bent down and started cutting bits off the trench boards to actually get the fire going. That's what the fireproofing meant. That's not what I originally thought. And you can only discover that through experimental archaeology. Here, recreating a listening post, far too big, but for the camera, it needed to be big so the camera could pick it up. And then this, that really annoyed people. How could I show the battlefield as being a blue sky, lovely puffy clouds, and green fields with a newly dug trench? Now, I'll be honest, that was dug using a JCB, but the point is that when the Germans fall back to the Hindenburg line, Siegfried line, they actually do so into open ground, meaning that we come up and dig in close to them. Now, I've only given you a few ideas, but this is an idea that I want you to take away with you. That man there is pulling back the curtain. He's pulling back the curtain on the past, and we're trying to do that. So when people come to site on our open days, leaflets about that at the back, they say, oh, children must find it very interesting. Actually, everybody finds it interesting because there's always something you can learn by walking through a landscape as a man would have experienced it. Daytime, dirt and sky. Nighttime, dirt and stars and the moon. My idea is to challenge our preconceptions. The Great War was not a war fought in black and white. It was experienced in colour, and we can hint at that colour. We'll never be able to entirely recreate it. But remember, I reckon we can do 99%. We'll leave 1% for the big screen. Thank you very much.